why would you choose Swift over Python? Now, personally, let me say I love Python. I think Python is one of the best languages that was ever written, because I've learned Python a bit and I know some things about Python. So I quite like the language, I would like to say that the reason I compare this particular languages is because I myself am going to be shifting into Swift, and over the next perhaps 1 year I would reflect on my journey of having switched over to Swift from Python, and I would want to sort of use this video as a reflection point or as a milestone to see how did I sort of fare, and then perhaps 1 year down the line I would make another video and say how was my journey of learning Swift when I chose to take it over Python, and what would have happened if I had perhaps taken Python. I don't know how's the future going to pan out, but I'm going to take this plunge and I'm going to go the Swift way. And the reason I'm going to do that is what I wanted to discuss in this video. So I have tried a couple of other languages before moving into even Python. So I have tried JavaScript, and I've tried a bit of Ruby, and I quickly moved out from Ruby into Python. And when I got into JavaScript, one of the biggest issues that I found with JavaScript was that the environment is too fragmented today, and there is no one version of JavaScript anywhere. So what I mean by that is, you have different environments. There is a version of JavaScript which is made by Facebook called React. There is a version of JavaScript made by Windows called TypeScript. So everybody has got their versions of JavaScript. Google has made a version of JavaScript called Angular, and every version is creating their subversions. For example, React is a version which covers JSX. So JSX replaces HTML. So everybody is looking at web in very different formats, and right now web is a melting pot of too many directions, too many things happening. So it's not really cohesive if one wants to sort of choose a particular path in the web world, because it's really going in all directions. So having chosen Python over JavaScript, I did some work on Python and I really loved that language, and I sort of wanted to get into machine learning and other sort of Python related programming genres. However, I realized that Swift would be my choice, and this is a video why I want to tell you why I'm choosing Swift over Python. So if you look at Swift and versus Python, so the way Apple sort of has positioned Swift is the way is that they've said that its performance is like that of a compiled language, because Swift is a compiled language, and its productivity, which is developer productivity, is like Python, Ruby, and JavaScript. And this is quite true because Swift is quite easy to write and it doesn't have too much of syntactical issues like if you use a JavaScript or an Objective-C. So in that sense, they have said that they positioned it on the quadrant where they said the developer productivity will be higher because the number of lines of code that you will write will be equivalent to, let's say, a Python, and the app performance will be much faster when compared to a Python or a JavaScript or a Ruby, just because it's interpreted, it's compiled, and the others are interpreted language. But that perhaps is not a reason for you to choose a language, would it be? Because that would mean an additional step of compilation versus interpretation. So what would be those things that are great about Python, and what are those things that are great about Swift? And what are the things that are good about Python, but not so good about Python, and not so good about Swift? So let's kind of explore that first. So Python, the good parts about Python, I think the greatest thing about Python is that it's a general purpose language. It's English-like. So if you've seen Python code, it's so easy to understand. Even if you don't understand programming, you would get a fairly good idea of Python code. So there are no semicolons, and the number of brackets are limited to as much as is required, and it uses a concept of white space, basically pushing the code towards the right side, and that becomes the indentation becomes really the way of separating code from a subcode. So that's a very nice method, which means that you and I would have the same way of writing Python. There is no other third way of writing Python. So you might look at anybody's Python code, it will not look different to you. And that's a great thing, because in other languages which don't use the concept of white space or indentation, you could have a bracket and you could have a semicolon, and you could write everything in the same line and nothing would happen. So somebody else was reading and you're used to a way of indenting the code, you might not understand, or you might struggle to understand the code where somebody is not indenting. So that's very good about Python. It's very general purpose, and it's got a great set of libraries. So Python has third-party libraries like NumPy, TensorFlow, MATLAB. There are lots of libraries, and it's also very popular in the student and academia space. So students, the first language is in any large university which is teaching computer science is Python. In academia, when you look at research and development, also Python is a very good language, because research and development focuses more on let's say you're researching on linear algebra. So you take mathematicians and you teach them a programming language, and it's not the other way around where you teach programmers mathematics. So mathematicians already have a depth of knowledge in a particular area, and they want to use that into programming, because programming would be using that knowledge and repeating that particular knowledge. So that's useful for them. So it's used extensively in the academia, and mostly for small scripts it can be written in Python very easily, because Python is quite an easy language, and you can write a small script. You want to create a calculator, you want to do that. You want to read a file from a set of folders, you can do that do that very easily. You can automate stuff, and that's very easy in Python. So small things are very easy in Python, and of course it's the language of the web. There is huge set of libraries like Django, Flask, and Pyramid, which are huge set of frameworks in Python, and in the web world Python has a huge mark. So if you are learning web in the server side of web, you've got a great sort of framework capability using Python. You also have Python in the neural networks space. So right now when you talk about artificial intelligence, or when you talk about automated systems, then Python really plays a big role there, because when it comes to machine learning, you could create a small machine learning code. You can have a large set of data. You could sort of sift through that data using one of these NumPy or TensorFlow libraries, look at patterns, and when those patterns emerge, you could sort of use those patterns in your in whatever program you want to use it. And in big data, again, large set of data, taking those data together, and making sense out of that. So it's pretty much omnipresent in a lot of sense. It's kind of the JavaScript of programmers. It's available everywhere, and that's a great thing about Python. Now let's look at some of those things which are not good about Python. So here are some of the things which are not great about Python. So number one, Python doesn't have any backers. So Python was created by a gentleman called Ron Godoff, who was basically creating a new language, and he created this language way back in 1990. So it's a single person who created the language, and to his credit, the language has done very well. But unlike any other languages which have come up, in the recent past, like for example Go, which is created by Google, Swift of course is created by Apple, and React is created by Facebook, Python doesn't have any backers. So what it means is that the growth of a programming language would really depend on the community. So if the community is supporting the language, it's going to grow. And to its credit, Python has really grown to a large extent, and and it's really done well for itself, because it didn't have sort of a father. It was everybody adopted it. So that's great. Python is an old language. It was created in 1990s, and it is like Java. It's pretty old. So what happens is that the new ways of interpreting data, the new ways of looking at web, or the new ways of acting and programming does not sort of completely fit into the Pythonic way, and some of this get fixed through new versions. For example, Python 2 has come and Python 3 has come. And this happens with every other language which is old. So for example, if you look at JavaScript has had so many versions. Today we're talking about ES6, and that's the latest version. But nevertheless, the biggest trouble, or the biggest bane for a programmer community when they're creating a new version, is that it has to be backward compatible. If it is not backward compatible, you lose the captive audience, because the captive audience then is able to move on to any other equivalent language which is equally good. So this happened with Angular 1 and Angular 2. Now Angular 2 is not backward compatible to Angular 1, and that has created this lacuna where people have been moving in from Angular 1 into React, because React is much better in comparison to Angular 2. But if Angular 2 was backward compatible and somebody has learned Angular 1, why would he spend time in learning React? He would spend some more time in learn Angular 2. So what I mean to say is that your stickiness is a function of the fact that you know the language, you're in the comfort zone. So somebody who knows Python, it's very unlikely for him to move out of Python and move into another language, unless Python sort of creates a new version of Python and calls it something else, so that you sort of move into that. And when that happens, they have so many options, and then they can move into some other language which is completely suited for that particular genre. So for example, right now if you're into machine learning, you could learn something called as R, or you could learn a language called as Julia. So why would you want to only stick to Python? You would stick to Python because you are comfortable with that language. And that's a bane, because if you're comfortable with that language, and if that language has some issues because of its aging, there is no other way but to sort of provide fixes to that. You won't solve the issues, because it's like the adage of why rock the boat, why sort of rock the apple cart. If it's not broken, why fix it? But sometimes you might need to create a cornucopian future which is completely different from the past. So legacy is the issue with Python. And coming on to the next one, it is slow, relatively slow, because it is an interpreted language. But I won't dwell too much into it, because slow is quite relative to not just the language but also the system that you use. So today the operating systems that we use are so fast that even if the language is slow, you really don't find too much of a difference in the speed. The next one is dynamically typed language that may fail silently during runtime. Now this is a big one. So if you're starting a new language, you need to know how to sort of declare a variable. You need to know what type of variable it is. It is a number or a string. And if you use a string on top of a number, there could be errors which can be thrown. So JavaScript is the biggest sort of culprit here, because in JavaScript you can pretty much do anything. You can add a number with a string and it won't even throw an error. Python is a little more sort of conscious about all these things, and it will not allow you to add a number and a string unless you convert the number into string and then add it, of course. But Swift is even more stricter in the sense that it will ask you to declare a variable, and you can't sort of pass that variable unless you have declared it. So when it comes to dynamically typed language, which is statically typed languages, I think it's important for somebody to learn the right way of doing things instead of just getting into programming and just quickly sorting things out because they want to develop something and then realizing that they've acquired a bad habit. It's better to start with a good habit. And Python might give you some bad habits, though not as bad as JavaScript. Okay, the next one is generalist, not a specialist like Rails. So what happens if you're into Python? So if you're in Python, you could move into web world, you could move into machine learning, you could move into academia, you could move into, there are so many options that you can move into. But at the end of the day, your skills are not portable in terms of your knowledge. So for example, if you're a web developer and if you go into machine learning, all that you've learned in web development becomes kind of redundant. It's not really useful. Okay, and that's the way everybody looks at it. So you become a novice when you get into machine learning. You might say, oh no, I know programming, I know Python, I know how it works. It's just a change in paradigm. And I would argue that, what you know is syntax, and what you know is the syntax of using that in a web environment. But the same environment, when you use that in neural networks, the paradigm itself is different. So being a generalist is good, but being a specialist is better. So if you are a web specialist and if you know everything about web and only everything about web, and you sort of increase your depth in web and you go into areas which are in that particular genre, compared to, let's say, move into another space, you sort of lose the tribal advantage of that particular knowledge that you gain. So generalist per se is not a great thing. So let's say, for example, Rails. Rails is a great framework which is created by Ruby, and it is used by most of the startups. And Rails is great because Rails is able to churn out very quick websites and web apps without you going through the constraints of large frameworks like Django and all of stuff. So it's very good at creating quick web apps. But if you're a Rails guy, then you get a Rails job, you get into a startup, you work really hard there, and you get some stock options and you stick around, and then you make $1 million there. Okay, so you're betting there really. But if you're not a Rails guy, then if you know Ruby, it's not much of use apart from anything else. So you stick onto that framework and it sort of forces you into an ecosystem. It doesn't let your mind wander around. But if you learn something which is general like Python, then you might learn you might learn web, and after some time you might say, oh, you know what, things are not happening in web. You might jump into another area because you think that you already know it. But that advantage becomes a disadvantage because you don't focus on a particular language, a particular area like web or machine learning. And then finally, neural networks that I was talking about in the good parts has started using other specific programming languages like R, Julia, and MATLAB. So these languages are tuned to neural networks kind of an environment, and they use the libraries which are created. For example, Mathematica is one of the libraries created. They use those libraries to the fullest extent, so they are optimized for neural networks. So it might just happen that if you go into neural networks, you'll have to learn R anyways. Okay, so you have to choose the area that you want to stay in. You want to choose the area. Is it neural networks or is it web development? And then the language sort of fits in there. It's not one shoe fits all. Julia is a good example here because Julia is a new language which is created specifically to align to the concepts of neural networks and machine learning and so on and so forth. So it uses the libraries to the fullest extent, and it has gone to such an extent of tuning that the indexation of Julia starts at number 1 and not at number 0, which is a departure from the programming languages paradigm. So what I'm trying to say is that for each language for each kind of paradigm there are language which is created, and that really is what I'm talking about, optimization. So let's come into the good parts about Swift. So the best part about Swift is the fact that it is part of the Apple ecosystem, and if you learn Swift, you are able to start programming in iOS, which is Mac. You are able to program for iPhone apps. You're able to program for Apple Watches. You're able to program for Apple TV, which has come up. You're able to now, you would also in the future be able to program for self-driving cars. So it's a huge ecosystem of products that you will be able to play around with, and because Apple is going to be using that language, it will optimize it to the extent that you just don't use the language in standalone mode. You use it in consensus with the other platforms they have, for example Cocoa Touch. So you start using Swift along with Cocoa Touch and Objective-C. So it sort of fits in very nicely into the overall ecosystem of Apple. So you don't have to worry about getting into Swift and start programming for Apple. Now Swift is also meant to be a performant language, and what it means by that is that it will be a very good language if you want to. It's sort of taken the best parts of Python and Ruby. So Python and Ruby are both considered programmer happy languages, and they are very performant. They are very focused on programmer productivity. So they get rid of a lot of unnecessary sort of things. For example, you don't have to declare a variable, you don't have to put in a lot of semicolons and so on and so forth, because you don't want the programmers to waste their time doing so. And most of the older languages had that issue. It wasn't really an issue, it was a style, and which sort of has moved on now. So Swift is aligned more towards the modern way of programming. So it doesn't have semicolons separating it, and it uses a very dynamic method of programming across the ecosystem. That's the best part of Swift, and that's good because Python is a very readable language. It's a very nice language to learn. The third point is that Swift is type safe, so it is statically typed. So what it means is that you have to declare the variables. You cannot change once you've declared the variables and you've chosen a particular type. You can't change it. So there are so many things which might sound sort of constraining in the beginning, but it will make you much smarter coder when you write your code. So you don't have to sort of second guess and start doing these things. So if another coder is coming and doing something, he will have to do it the Swift way, which is good, especially if you're learning a new language. And it's new, so it will learn from the past errors of other languages. So that's a great thing. It's only launched in 2014. And the final point is that it's starting out. So you can be an expert in Swift. Imagine you're learning Swift for another 5 years. You've got 5 years of solid experience in Swift. Imagine you learn Python for the next 5 years. You would not have 5 years of Python. You'll have 5 years of Python experience. That's great. I'm not doubting it. But there'll be so many other Pythonics or Python programmers who would have learned it from 1990s to 1990s to 2000 and all of that, who would have 20 years of experience, and you would never be a master in front of them because they would be the kings of their areas. But with Swift, you will be the master in the next 5 years. You would command a respect as a programmer, which if you take an old programming language, you'll never be able to. Yes, you will find a lot of challenges because Swift is evolving and it's coming out on its own. But you are investing your skills for the future. So if you invest your skills now and you start learning it, you will probably start contributing even to the source code. And who knows, that's going to be something that you like. But imagine you're going to contribute to Python source code. That's next to impossible. Because it's already set. There are so many ways of doing it. If you come and contribute there, your way might not be the right way. So I think Swift is kind of a startup. So you always invest in a startup. So I think that's about it. I just want to kind of quickly cover the bad parts also. So Swift also has some issues. So the bad part about Swift is that because it is a new language, though it doesn't touch Objective-C and doesn't have all the bad things about Objective-C, it does have to be backward compatible because Apple couldn't have created a language which was not talking to their previous systems and completely sitting in thin air. So that couldn't have been a risk that Apple could have afforded. So they created a language which is backward compatible. So Objective-C is an old language, so there are parts of Objective-C which Swift might have definitely adopted. Swift is new and evolving, so do not expect it to have a library like TensorFlow. So if you're using it for machine learning, you'll struggle. If you want to use it for backend server-side programming, you will struggle. You will not have libraries, or you will not have frameworks which you can use for backend web development, and that's going to be a challenge because Swift code is right now even as we speak, it's under development. It's not even exposed to Windows environment. It's only open to Mac and Linux environment. So now it will open to Windows environment, and then it will open up through third-party libraries. So the journey is going to take some time. It's not going to be like snap of a finger, you will know everything in Swift, and you would have everything. You just call out, and people provide you that data, which is a good thing because you'll have time to sort of sink into the language. You'll never feel that the language is too overwhelming and it's so big. So you'll have sort of time to grow along with the language. So it's a good thing and a bad thing, because somebody wants to do something very quickly in Swift, he will struggle. Swift constrains you to Apple ecosystem, though it is open sourced. You never know who's going to adopt Swift, and how good is that adoption going to be. So it's a constraint in the Apple ecosystem. Swift is compiled, though it has playground for quick checks. So remember, it's not an interpreted language, which means that Swift will have to be compiled every time you have to run the code. So it's got a quick and dirty way of doing it by using something called as playground, where you can type something and watch your code. But if you run a complete program and you want to sort of use it on a system, then you will have to compile it, and then you have to build that onto the system, and only the source code goes to the system, where you don't see the language itself. So unlike something like JavaScript, where you just write something and it immediately becomes available, you upload the code and becomes available. Here you have an additional step of compiling. And as I was mentioning, Swift has no third-party libraries like Python, so that is kind of a bummer right now, but that's what happens with every new language. It has to grow on its own, and over the period of next 3 to 4 years, it will start developing those third-party libraries. And the best part is Apple is committed to Swift, and it is going to move its entire stack, hopefully in the next couple of, maybe not couple of years, maybe like in the next 1 decade, it will definitely move it out of Objective-C into Swift. So that's the good and the bad parts of it. So I think finally I would like to raise the debate. I don't say that Python is a bad programming language or Swift is a better one. It's just that the perspective that you use to take a programming language would be different for different people. And here is a perspective I wanted to share. And I believe that Swift is the future. It can do the complex sort example which was given when it was launched. It can do that at 3.9x, almost 4 times the speed of Python, and it's almost double the speed of Objective-C. So in those sense, Swift is good. Well, it's got a huge learning curve because you'll have to grow along with the language. But the good part is that at least it gives you an opportunity to learn with the grow with the language. It's the future. So you could say that I want to be comfortable, I want to get into a language and know everything about it, and I want sort of a lot of help in doing that. Or you could choose that I want to join a language which sort of gives me an opportunity to experiment and do things which others have not done. So in that sense, Swift sort of gives you the best of the both worlds, because it gives you the support of an ecosystem like Apple, and it also is a startup language. It's not completely standing on its own. It doesn't mean that if the developer stops, the guy who developed Swift moves out of Apple, Swift is going to stop. So for example, Chris Latner, who's moved out of, who's supposed to be the founder of Swift with many other people, I'm sure, he has moved out into Tesla, and that if it had happened, for example, in a language like Vue.js, or if it happened in a language which is like Python in the inception of that language, it would have been disastrous for that language, because you need a sort of commitment of a long term from that individual who has created the language, who just focuses on the language. He's not focused on just the career part of it. But in this particular case, because the ecosystem is supporting it, even if one individual moves out, the ecosystem continues to grow with the language. So that's the great part about Swift. I think I've chosen Swift. I might revisit this topic after maybe 6 months to a year, and I would reflect on my journey of learning Swift. What are the good parts of Swift? I'll keep in touch with Python, though I'm not going to leave Python. It's a good language to sort of have a look and sometimes feel happy about, but Swift is the way to go, and I would highly recommend it. So with that, I'd like to end this presentation, and I would like to sort of say thank you for listening to me all this while. If you've got any strong comments or weak comments or any kind of comments, please do not hesitate to put them in the comment section. Thanks very much. Have a great day.